Greetings to everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm honored to be kind of co-moderator with Havrylyshyn. So that's a big honor. Yes, to be a part of this audience. I am also, beside being a doctor and being active as a teacher and a scholar, I am the head of NGO myself. So this topic is very close to me and to my everyday life. So I'm interested the same in this topic from another side as most of the audience. And here we will have the four key speakers from the States. We will have their presentations, and we will also, after the presentation, we all will have some time to ask questions. And the questions will be to any of the speakers or to all of them. It depends. So you have to be very attentive to what is each topic about, and it is very different. All the four speakers, they have their fields of interest and their directions of research. And when I was reading the short, like the brief information, I was very also interested to listen to the whole presentation of the four of you, and maybe if we have some additional comments from the audience, because I understand that all the 50 of you are not just walking by, and you are deeply in the topic. And because NGO, not for the last year, but for the last 9 years, NGO is that force that move the country. So we started 9 years ago to be the support, the back and the front of the processes, and now for the last year, it's just we had that anniversary. We are also the movers and those like the hope for the recovery and the development of the country. So I'm also honored to be opening the discussion, the colloquium on the role of nonprofit organizations for Ukraine's recovery. And the first speaker, we will have Dr. Rory Eckardt, the associate professor from the Binghamton University, but I asked the speakers to present themselves, not to mix information, not to mispronounce, and to have them tell you the most important information about themselves and their topic. What is the most interesting for us about you? So Dr. Rory Eckardt, the floor is yours. You are welcome to start that discussion.
Thank you. Let me open up my slides. Okay, can everyone see my slides?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
we can.
Excellent, thank you.
Before we start the presentation, just a small announcement. If there is any problem with listening, with picture, or with the speed of the speaker, please probably tell us in the chat or raise your hand, and we will try to make that slowly, or it depends what is the problem. Just feel free to stop if there is any questions you have.
Okay, all right, thank you. So hi everyone, my name is Rory Eckardt. I'm an associate professor of strategy at the School of Management at Binghamton University. Today I'm going to talk to you about a paper that I published that is on the role of corporate governance and performance in nonprofit organizations. So the full citation for the paper is at the bottom of the screen there. All right, so let's start first with what is corporate governance? If we start first with the kind of very structural sort of definition or very technical definition, corporate governance is the structures, processes, and institutions that are used to make and oversee decisions and allocate resources within organizations. This is essentially just a fancy way of saying, what are the sort of practices about how decision makers are monitored and rewarded in organizations. For this, we often talk about factors such as the structure and composition of the board of directors for an organization, what sort of oversight there is for CEO compensation and other aspects around the CEO or the head of an organization, and then just more broadly, other practices that are in place to try to improve transparency for the organization. Okay, so next question I think is, why does it matter? It matters due to some theories that are related to the potential for there to be principal-agent conflict in organizations. So by principals, what we mean are owners of organizations, and agents, we mean the managers of those organizations. And so when we have differences, separation between owners and managers of organizations, there's the possibility for them to have different interests, different goals, and then for the actions to be in conflict.
Sorry, Rory, I'm just gonna, your slides are still stuck on slide 1, just so you know.
Sorry about that.
There we go. Yeah.
Andre, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, I'm on slide 3 now. Can you see that?
Yes.
Sorry about that technical problem. Okay, so why does corporate governance matter? It has to do with theories related to the potential for there to be misalignment between principals and agents. So principals being the owners of an organization and the agents being the managers of those organizations. And there can be differences in goals between those two organizations. They can have different interests, different things that they want to focus on. And this can manifest in a way where you can have misappropriation of resources and suboptimal performance of the organization. So it can be problematic for the performance of that organization because resources may be used in ways that are benefiting the managers of those organizations, but not necessarily the organization and what its broader mission and purpose is. So this refers to agency theory. Agency theory has been around for a long time, back into the 70s. And there's been lots and lots of research that is focused on these corporate governance practices, which are designed to try to lessen the impact of this misalignment between principals and agents, owners and managers. Lots of research on this topic in for-profit organizations. And it's even gone as far to impacting some of the regulatory requirements, particularly for publicly traded companies, based on ensuring that they have these corporate governance practices. Okay, did that slide move forward to the next one? Okay, good. Okay, so despite all this interest in for-profit organizations, started to see that it was getting some of these corporate governance practices were starting to get more and more attention in the nonprofit sector. We were seeing this among academics. We were also seeing this among practitioners. Surveys of the CEOs or presidents of nonprofits were increasingly thinking about some of these corporate governance practices. Should they have a board of directors? And if they do have a board of directors, what is the role of that board in overseeing the key staff and CEOs? What are the best ways to structure and compose those boards? And so we started to see more and more interest. I think are continuing to see more and more interest on some of these corporate governance practices being applied in the nonprofit sector. But there, I think, were some fundamental questions about whether or not these corporate governance practices, which are really designed to be in for-profit organizations, whether or not these would actually work in nonprofit organizations. And so we started to look at the literature and the research that was out there to see whether or not there was any empirical evidence, any data to support the benefits of corporate governance in nonprofit organizations. And surprisingly, we found very, very few studies that had looked at this question. So really the fundamental research question for us in this paper is, do corporate governance practices, particularly those that are commonly used in for-profit organizations, do those impact the performance of nonprofit organizations? Now, in applying corporate governance to the nonprofit sector, there were some unique considerations that we had to take into mind. The first is that most nonprofits or charity organizations, a particular type of nonprofit that we're focused on in this paper, don't have shareholders per se. And so who really are the principals in that case? Clearly they have managers, they have agents, but who are the potential principles that there could be misalignment of interest? And when we actually went back into the research early in this area, some of the original papers in there, one by Fama and Jensen in 1983, actually talked about the application of corporate governance in nonprofit sectors and said really the donors to those charities, the donors to those nonprofits are in that principal role. So in this case, rather than viewing shareholders as these principals for there to be misalignment of interest, we're viewing donors as those principals and the possibility for there to be misalignments between the donors to a nonprofit and the managers of that nonprofit. The second unique consideration we had to think about is that unlike in for-profit organizations, where there's often a lot of media coverage and analyst coverage and shareholders that have a vested interest because they're getting financial returns or lack thereof back to themselves, have an inherent incentive to monitor that organization to see what they're doing. And there's also increasingly a number of regulatory monitoring mechanisms for those for-profit, particularly publicly traded for-profit organizations. And there's less of these for nonprofit organizations. And we actually took the position on this initially that probably would increase the importance of some of these corporate governance practices in nonprofit organizations because there are less other entities that are inherently aligned or focused on trying to ensure that the managers are doing what's in the best interest of the organization and the principals, the donors in this case. Lastly, when we're talking about the application of corporate governance in for-profit firms, there's often an orientation towards more maximizing profits, and that if you don't have corporate governance and you have these principal agent misalignments, it can reduce the degree to which that maximizing profit sort of orientation is focused on more about driving up profits. And as you know, nonprofits kind of in their definition, in their name, are not focused on profits, not focused on those outcomes. And so what do we mean when we talk about performance then and the role that corporate governance plays? And we took the position that it's really more about trying to maximize the social impact of the organization and the degree to which misalignment between the principals and the agents, the donors and the managers, could create possible issues in that regard. And so rather than thinking about a profit-oriented or some other financial-oriented measure for performance in this study, we were looking at how much of the expenses of the organization are focused on the mission of that organization. So the degree to which the monies that they're raising are really being focused on trying to maximize that social impact. So we had 4 hypotheses in this study. So the first was that was talking about independent boards. Essentially, independent boards are when your board of directors is composed in a majority manner of individuals that don't have direct monetary or other ties to the organization. So they're more likely to be able to be independent. And we thought that when these are present for charities, they are likely to increase the percent of the funds that are focused on the mission, focused on the social impact of the organization. Our second hypothesis was about the positive role of CEO governance, so oversight that the board has over the CEO or president of the organization. The third hypothesis was about a kind of broad set of practices related to trying to improve transparency of the organization and positing that this would improve the performance as well. And then lastly, we had an overall governance measure, which essentially was a composite of all of these other 3 aspects. So to test these hypotheses, we used a sample of large US charities between 2009 and 2017. And our data that we used for this are annual tax filings that we obtained via Charity Navigator, which is a big watchdog of charity organizations. There were 11 broad types of charities that were within our sample. And as I mentioned, these were pretty large charities. So they had average annual donations of $11.5 million US dollars, and collectively over the time frame had raised approximately $350 billion in donor contributions. So a substantial amount of funds, right, that were associated with these charities. So our final sample had about close to 7,000 charities and 30,000 observations. So it was a big kind of longitudinal analysis of these questions. Just talking quickly about some of the measures. So for this focus on how much of their funds that are being spent are on the mission, We use a proportion of expenses that are focused on the organization's programs and services. For independent boards, we use a simple measure of 1 or 0 to indicate whether or not there was majority independence among the board of directors. For CEO governance, we looked at 3 different components. So whether or not there were explicit policies that are focused on CEO pay. This is similar to like the compensation committees that publicly traded companies will have. Whether or not loans would be given, personal loans would be given to the CEO. And then lastly, disclosure information about the CEO salary. And then for the transparency, we looked at 4 different components: whether or not the board members were explicitly listed on the charity's website, whether or not key staff were explicitly listed, explicit policies around donor privacy, and then lastly, whether or not they published their financials. And then we had an overall governance measure as well, as I mentioned, was essentially a standardized composite of these 3 practices. So we looked at our data analyses using fractional regression. This is a technique to deal with essentially ratio-oriented measures. And we also looked at it using Tobit as well. And all the hypotheses were supported. So I'm not sure if you're able to see it on the right side. It's laid out in the paper as well. But all of these corporate governance practices were positively and significantly associated with the performance measure in this case. So how much of the funds were focused on the mission of the charity. So some implications and takeaway points, which is probably the most important part, perhaps, of this talk. So I mean, I think first and foremost, this shows that, or at least demonstrates support for the idea that some of these common corporate governance best practice, approaches in for-profit firms, so independent boards, CEO oversight, transparency, et cetera, that these can increase the effectiveness of nonprofits by helping to focus their efforts on the organization's mission. So another way to say that is that some of these corporate governance practices about the boards of nonprofits can be potential tools to help that organization maximize its social impact, to help improve the degree to which it can achieve the intended social impact that it wants. I think the second takeaway from this is to encourage nonprofit organizations to think about having a board of directors and to think about structuring in a way that's consistent with these best practices. I think it's also worth pointing out that besides doing this corporate governance and monitoring oversight sort of role, boards also can be important strategic resources for firms. Board of directors also can play counseling or consulting roles for organizations. And so besides just helping to kind of keep the organization and its managers focused on its intended mission and social impact, they also can help with actually the implementation and fulfillment of that impact. Third, I think takeaway or thing to think about is what are other ways to address the principal agent conflict in nonprofits. So we talked about some of these corporate governance practices, but there also could be other ways about how the pay is structured for CEOs and key staff. So whether or not there are certain key outcomes that there could be bonus pay, for example, linked to, or a portion of their base pay that is related to achieving the intended social outcomes of that organization. Another way to structure it would be to offer donors the ideas of having contingent donations. So initially they'll make a certain donation and have them agree to, if the organization achieves certain social outcomes or those associated with the missions, that there'll be additional donations that will be given. And then just lastly, just putting it out there to think about whether or not, are there other places that we can take some of the kind of for-profit logic or for-profit, perspectives and, best practices that we could apply to nonprofit firms? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I didn't tell you that you were 1 minute out of time because you were in time. So thank you. That was interesting and fast. So you raise your hand in intense or just, there is not Natalie's hand raised? Was it in purple?
I was clapping and now I'm trying to
okay. So thank you for the first speaker. Keep your questions or write them down somewhere, because I see some people are eager to ask, but as we decided, we will have the 4 speakers. Now we are having, so the next speaker is Dr. Bethany Cockburn. and she's asking me to be presented by herself. So Dr. Bethany, you're welcome to start your presentation. The floor is yours. Please tell us some words about yourself. And sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Perfect. So I'm going to try pronouncing something for the first time. Dobry den? Did that okay?
Right. Yeah, that was perfect.
Thank you. It was, I don't know about perfect, but we'll call it, it was as good. I tried. I definitely tried. I am, my name is Bethany Cockburn. I am an assistant professor at Northern Illinois University, and most of my life I've been in this area, so it's pretty much near Chicago. This is based on data that was also published in a Journal of Applied Psychology in 2021. And I want to just tell you that I am, even though I'm in a college of business and I've been in the for-profit world for a long time, I have a total deep love for nonprofits and the work that is done there. I actually have a master's degree from a Catholic university, the University of Notre Dame, from their College of Business, but it's a nonprofit master's. So I love it. I've worked in nonprofits a lot of my life, but more from an academic side. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to talk to you all about sort of the people side of what stress is like in nonprofits and some things that we can do to hopefully help people who are in a really stressful experience. So what you see from the title is it's supporting heroes during a megathreat. And what I want to say is it's kind of a tricky title. I was kind of tricky in the title because I'm going to make the argument that we don't want to call people heroes, even though we're going to be talking about those today. So second, let's see if I can, did that advance for people? Did that advance for you? So can you see background megathreat? Thank you. What I'm talking about when I say megathreat is a negative large scale event. And so you can see on the left, this first photo is from an article Andre, who's presenting today, recommended about people who are repairing power lines in Ukraine during this full-scale invasion by Russia. And so they get referred to as heroes. And on the right is what our sample was medical professionals during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when they're being called heroes and asked to basically put themselves at risk without the correct masks and personal protective equipment. And so what we're talking about here is this experience of calling people heroes, a lot of whom are at nonprofits. So most of our hospitals, most of our medical care is situated in nonprofits. And so hopefully some of this, especially the stress that is experienced, will be applicable and you'll be able to get something out of this. And so one thing that both these workers have in common is they're working in a difficult situation. They're being asked to do difficult things, possibly their own personal sacrifice. And so we call them heroes. And so how does situating them as heroes, how does that affect how we see them, what we experience, and how we help them? So the research background for this is during the COVID-19 pandemic, essential workers have generally been enduring a lot of hardships and sacrifices on their job. So this doctors lacking PPE bullied into treating COVID-19 patients is a title from a popular press article that was in the United States. So this was a time when doctors were being asked to go into hospital rooms. Nurses were being asked to go into hospital rooms without masks or working around people they knew were sick. So their coworkers were sick and they're being asked to work with them. They're working long hours. They're not being provided with things they needed. So there's a lot of physical sacrifice. There's a lot of emotional sacrifice. And so as a result, a lot of people were calling them heroes. We were saying things like, "You're our hero," or "Heroes work here." They're put on banners that like went across big highways. So we had this like real narrative that if you are doing this essential work, that you are a hero. And it was being talked about in the media. It was on social media. We were saying it informally, like we were thanking people as we were leaving the checkout lines at a grocery store. We're saying these words, "You're a hero." And I think this happens in these mega threat events. We think of people in these sort of like almost superhuman terms because they're doing things that most of us wouldn't want to do, or, in some way we wouldn't be able to do. And so we are wondering at the time, this was back in 2020, we were wondering, what is it doing to our psyche? What is it doing to how we treat people when we call them heroes? And we kind of went in agnostically, not really knowing what to expect. And so to that end, we actually ended up collecting 3 time points. So if you're familiar with this specific journal, they had what was called a rapid review process. And so you would submit something, and then they had a guaranteed amount of time that they had to turn it back to you. So we started with study 1 and 2. Study 1 is essentially a vignette study where we're asking, them, sorry, I just realized I've missed something in the previous slide. Let me see if I should scoot back to it. I think we're okay. We're going to just keep moving. So in the method section for the first one, it was essentially, if you're familiar with them, a vignette study. So it was an kind of experimental design. The second study was a 2-point field study. We got an R&R and had to immediately collect a 3 time point study to go along with that. And what is interesting about that I won't talk about now, but we can talk about later if you want, is because study 1 and 2 were done early in 2020 and study 3 was done late in 2020, we actually were starting to see a shift in how people were answering these questions. Study 1 and 2 were really similar, and then study 3 started to look different, which is interesting, I think, in light of the fact that we just had the 1-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion, right? So I think that's interesting. The one thing I will talk about methodologically, and I won't talk more about the results or the methods unless you want me to, is what the heroism scale was that we used in study 2 and 3. So it was very simple. We just asked people how much they agreed with the statement. These people are likely to be seen as heroes. So they were saying how much they agreed to certain statements. One other thing I want to just say that I think is interesting, and part of how this really applies to other nonprofits, not just medical professionals, is in study 1, we intentionally tested for-profit grocery stores and nonprofit healthcare, because we thought maybe there's a status difference or maybe it's a type of work difference, and it didn't matter. When we were looking at if someone was called a hero versus if they were called a victim, the results held. So it was really this idea of just how we're talking about people as heroes or victims that mattered. Okay, so now what are the results? So if we talk about people as heroes, if we talk about them as heroes, as their coworkers, as their bosses, as their friends, there's an emotional penalty that they experience. So we're less likely to sympathize or empathize with them if we're also calling them a hero. And I think this is kind of chilling, because what we're trying to do essentially is go, hey, thank you for what you do. And we think that we didn't test this, but we think a psychological mechanism that is happening in the background is this idea that if you do one moral thing, you check that box and then you're done for the day. And so by saying, thank you for your service, thank you for what you're doing for us, now we are sort of done with that and we can move past it, and we're not thinking about them as like people who are also victims, because you can be both, right? You can be doing heroic work, but also be put in a really hard situation. And so emotional penalty of heroism. There's also an action penalty. So if people are thinking of someone who's doing this work, in this case, these doctors, these nurses, these medical professionals, if we're thinking of them as heroes rather than as the victims who don't have what they need to do their work, we're less committed to helping them, and we're less committed to taking political action on their behalf. And so I think this is particularly interesting when we think about, what do we want people to be doing? Do we want people to be saying thank you? Do we want people to be saying you're a hero and putting them on a pedestal? Or do we want people to be saying, hey, we need to actually we need to change the political landscape to support the people who are trying to do this work? And so it's interesting and it's complicated. The last thing is on a personal level, somebody who's watching these people who are doing this, we're going to call it heroic work because it is heroic work. These folks were people who were also starting to experience a level of moral distress. So you're watching it, it's hard to watch, right? It's a hard thing that people are doing. It's hard to see them. It's hard to see what they're having to experience. And so if we take that back and say, this is even more heightened, this experience of emotional distress is even more heightened when you think someone is when you really value the work they do, and if you really value being a good person. It's an interaction, a 3-way interaction that basically, if you are really caring about the person, if you're really caring about doing the right thing for them, your own moral distress can be higher as time goes on. So that's just another thing to think about, is how it's affecting your emotions, because we know over time stress can be really damaging to us physically. So that was all dark and sad, but what do I want us to take out of it? The most important thing is that actions matter more than words. So it feels so good to say, you're my hero, thank you for everything you do. But it's really the actions we take that matter. So what do we know from the stress research? Because we're talking about stress here, right? Keep the workload manageable. So if you're a manager and you are saying, heroes work here, okay, but also you need to keep the workloads manageable. So not asking people to do too much work, not asking them to switch tasks too rapidly, not asking them to do more work than they have time to do in the day. We know that manages stress. A second thing that manages stress is giving people autonomy to do the work in the way that they want to do it, doing it in the order they want, sort of having some sort of control, not micromanaging them. That's another way to help people manage stress at work. And just sort of, and then the third piece is just about, so this general awareness of what you're experiencing. So if you're managing someone, or if you're working in a situation with coworkers who are doing this really difficult work in a difficult situation, just sort of watching your own stress and trying to manage that and doing self-care. The thing that I would say that I want to advocate for the most is that bottom one, giving grace, sympathy and empathy and patience, regardless of how you think the person is doing, how heroic they're being. And I think that it's probably a second thing, and this is just my opinion, that we get the word hero and superhero confused. So we think of people who are doing this amazing work as superheroes. Superheroes are magic. They don't need any help. They're the ones who are supposed to save us. They don't need masks, right? They're superheroes, other than maybe they're like superhero masks. So what I want to say is like really trying to separate out the superhero, this sort of thing that people don't need support with, from the actual reality, which is that yes, they're doing heroic work, but they're not superheroes. They need us. So let me know. I think we're holding questions, but that is all I had. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. I think that the topic about heroes of heroes, that's very up to date now, because we are having so many heroes right now. I think that the NGO members, they are heroes, volunteers, soldiers, and that word is very common. So every day we are using heroes in our speech. So I think that's the same important to pronounce, to say, to write as to act. And it just reminds me, that's not the question, but it just reminds me of the topic I heard several years ago. That was in France. The dissertation was dedicated to the word thank you as a motivation for better management and for better performance in the organization. That was about the hospital, and there was a connection between saying thank you to the workers and their better performance. And that was the whole dissertation, the research, just one word. So thank you for the interesting topic you touched. And there is, okay, the superhumans, we have that, the comment in the chat. So the next speaker is Miss Nataliia Yakushko. She's presenting the University of Tennessee, and she's presenting herself, and that's more, I think, every next speaker is closer to the Ukrainian NGO topic as the previous one. So now, Ms. Nataliia, the floor is yours. Please present yourself and the fields of interest. Tell us some words, and then we are very happy to listen to your presentation.
Yes, ma'am. Give me a second. I'm not sure what you can see and what you cannot see. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we do. We do.
Let me try them. Do you see it now? Is it better like this or no?
No, it's still too small. I think it's better to have it bigger, like the full.
What about now?
Yes.
Is it better now?
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay, so my name is Nataliia Yakushko. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Tennessee. And today I'm going to be presenting a huge study on Ukrainian individuals and how they deal with this war, how they're coping, and what we can help, and what kind of guidance we can give them in order to be more healthy and feel better during this war. So today I'm going to be presenting one study from 3 of the studies that are working right now. So in March, we applied for a grant at the National Science Foundation, and we got $200,000 to study Ukrainian entrepreneurs. So as we see right now, we're going to be focusing on resilience, coping, and well-being during the war in Ukraine. This is a quantitative approach, a quantitative study. We have 2 studies that focuses on both entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs. Just quick question, do you see my notes on the right or no? Okay, that's great. We also did 2 other studies. They take a little bit different approach. And the reason why we are talking about all 3 of them is we're going to be connecting them in the future. And we see some antecedents from each of the studies that help us to understand how Ukrainians cope with this war and how they build this resilience through the war. So with this study, we try to examine how different dimensions of psychological trait-based resilience impact the extent of psychological trauma and well-being of individuals, and how specific coping strategies can affect your relationship between those components of trait resilience and different well-being outcomes. So the big motivation for the study we had from the literature, actually, and the existing literature said that they only focus basically on one stressor at a time. As an example, it can be an earthquake, it can be a hurricane, and they only focus on one event. However, as we see in Ukraine, we have so many different events. One day we can lose the electricity, another day we get bombed, another time individuals are losing a job or something else. So in our situation, we cannot focus on only one stressor. The other thing, that majority of research on coping and resilience work has been conducted in aftermath of the catastrophe. So they're not focusing on what is actually happening during the catastrophe and how that affects individuals during the war. And as we talk about war, prior research and study on war at the individual level typically focuses on soldiers, medical personnel, and families that are left behind. However, we want to study how regular civilians, how regular individuals who go to work every day experience this war and how they build this resilience. And what is it actually resilience by itself? So this is our model. We broke down trait resilience to adaptability, emotional regulation, optimism, self-efficacy, and social support. And we want to see how the trait resilience affect well-being, such as depression, emotional exhaustion, and PTSD. And in this situation, we would call them not well-being, but ill-being. And how Ukrainians can use different coping styles in order to maximize this resilience, in order to decrease depression, decrease emotional exhaustion, and decrease PTSD. So in our first study, we look at loss orientation, restoration orientation, and isolation orientation. And we're going to talk about them a little bit more in details. We also want to see how exactly each trait resilience affect each different coping style and affect each different well-being outcome. So what is resilience and why we decided to break down this resilience by 5 different parts? So in general, we anticipate that the first dimension of resilience, such as adaptability, emotional regulation, optimism, and social support, will decrease problems civilians have with the war, such as PTSD, emotional exhaustion, and depression. However, in our study, we saw interesting results. We see that self-efficacy will actually have an opposite outcome and will increase this problem, such as because self-efficacy in our situation will create this illusion that individuals will know, like, hey, I have this control, I can do this. And this basically increase their emotional exhaustion and increase their level of PTSD. As we talk about different coping styles, we're focusing on study 1 on loss orientation, restoration orientation, and isolation orientation. Basically, loss orientation is when an individual confront the loss and think through the loss and try to make sense why the situation happened. As a restoration orientation is distracting yourself with thinking from something else, It can also be doing some new things, changing lifestyle, or changing completely and distracting yourself. And oscillation orientation, basically moving back and forth between loss orientation and restoration orientation. And then we're going to see how this different coping style actually affect well-being of individuals. So for study one, we had 612 individuals, and we contacted them through so many Ukrainian nonprofits and so many organizations in Ukraine. And we contacted them through Leaders of Changes. It's a nonprofit in Kyiv, local chambers of commerce, European Business Association, Boyden Advisory Forum, Young Business Club, and Kyiv Volontersky. So every time when somebody completed our survey, we were donating $35 to a nonprofit of their choice. So with the study one, we donated a little bit more than $21,000 to 3 nonprofits such as Leaders of Change, Serhiy Pritula Foundation, and Come Back Alive. So what we saw from our study, what we saw from our results. So basically we saw that emotional regulation, optimism, and social support will decrease the problematic outcomes, such as expected from the literature. However, self-efficacy would increase depression and emotional exhaustion, which is what we kind of predicted. And it's kind of contrary to prior work on resilience and PTSD. In this study, we also controlled for the age, gender, marital status, number of children, prior combat exposure, current location in Ukraine, since we didn't want to include only individuals who are in the western part of Ukraine or in Kyiv, or people who stayed in Ukraine, since they would be a priori resilient. So we included both people who left Ukraine and stayed in Ukraine. As we look at how different coping styles affect well-being of Ukrainians, we found that loss orientation will decrease depression and emotional exhaustion, while restoration and oscillation orientation would increase ill-being, such as depression, emotional exhaustion, and PTSD. And then we go back to our resilience, and we lastly look how this resilience leads to different coping orientation. And we see that adaptability, self-efficacy, and social support will increase this loss orientation and help cope. So with these interesting results, we went back and we realized we need to do study 2 just to prove our results. So what we did, we broke down the different coping styles, and we wanted to see how actually Ukrainians cope and what actually helped them to cope. And this breakdown came from study 2, from the qualitative study, since we heard so many Ukrainians telling us that they use humor, they they need some extra support from the outsiders. So what we did, we used different measures for coping. And we looked how distracting themselves, being active, denial, substance use, emotional support, disengagement, venting, just support from the outsiders, renaming the situation, humor, self-blame, acceptance, planning, and religion can affect this ill-being, and what can actually help us to either decrease this depression, decrease this emotional exhaustion, and help us to stay sane. So with the study 2, we actually finished study 2 in January and finished data cleaning and data analysis last week. And for the study 2, we had 7,678 individuals with a more than 90% of completion rate. And we contacted them through 2 local US-based nonprofits, Liberty Ukraine Foundation and Brighter Ukraine. And we donated more than $65,000 to both of those nonprofit organizations. They did a tremendous work with us, tremendous work, since the survey by itself was already pretty long. It was 1 hour and 25 minutes long. And that's why the donation was a little bit higher than the previous time. So, and surprisingly, our results actually hold. So what we see in the study 2, as we measured different coping style, here we see that our findings indicate that emotional regulation, optimism, and self-efficacy largely decrease the use of coping behaviors, while adaptability would increase them, and social support is a mix depending on specific coping behavior. And moving forward, how can we actually use this, and how can we, what can we say about different coping styles and ill-being or well-being? And we see this coping behavior also impact ill-being in a specific way, such as emotional support and reframing the situation and acceptance will improve ill-being outcomes by decreasing them. And while other attempts at coping largely worsen effect on individual well-being. So basically what we're saying that emotional support, such as comforting somebody, understanding what people are experiencing with, can decrease depression, can increase emotional exhaustion and PTSD, as well as reframing the situation and seeing something good in this war can help to be emotionally stable, as well as acceptance. However, distracting yourself, being active, denial, substance use, venting, disengagement, support by helping, humor, self-blame, and planning would actually support and increase depression, increase emotional exhaustion, and PTSD. So with this study, we try to contribute to both literature and practice, and our findings also reveal departure from what we expect from the literature. And we think that the reason is that the key difference with the war is that it's ongoing process and it's chronic, and the losses might also be chronic as well. As a result, we see that we speculate based on our findings that the loss orientation approach to coping might be useful when implementing to cope with loss as it continues to happen, rather than at the end of the event, as a prior research said. And engaging at the loss orientation while still being immersed in a traumatic situation might be a reason why we see decrease in depression when using this loss orientation. And for the restoration orientation, avoiding the stressor might not be possible due to the chronic of the event and the acute nature of the war, as well as a very high level of combat exposure experienced by civilians in our study. And almost 90% of individuals who took our survey, they either saw somebody wounded or they saw something happening in Ukraine, something traumatic. And so thus, trying to use this restoration orientation in the context might end up increasing adverse well-being outcomes, as revealed in the consistent positive relationship we found between the restoration orientation and PTSD. So basically, with this study, we try to see what can help Ukrainians to cope, and what can we do to help them cope, and what kind of coping mechanism is most helpful for them to not to develop the depression, not to be emotionally exhausted, and increase well-being in general. And this is it for me.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And the more I'm listening, the more I have the feeling that we need the whole additional symposium for each of you, just to listen to your presentation, to your results of the research, and have the discussion over that. So now we are coming to the last speaker, last but not the least, the final, the summarizing, the closing speaker, that's Havrylyshyn. And the family name is well known for the civil activists in Ukraine and for the civil society as a whole, and for every NGO member, I think, in Ukraine. Yes, because Havrylyshyn is a nephew of Bogdan Havrylyshyn, and I'm not presenting anymore. Just Dr. Havrylyshyn, and please tell something more about yourself and your topic.
Sure, thank you. So I'm Andre Havrylyshyn. I'm an assistant professor at Binghamton University, so Rory and I are colleagues, and that's also a good opportunity for me to share that. So the paper I'm going to be presenting, I'm first author, but my co-authors are Nataliia and Rory, so I just wanted to explicitly mention that. So I'll share my screen here. Everyone can see that? Okay, I'm going to try to move a little quicker because I want to try to leave as much time as possible for questions. But I do want to focus on something with this introductory slide other than the beautiful kvitetut. And that is, I've highlighted the words in our working title because this is a working paper. We're still writing it and researching and doing data collection and such. no, data collection. I'll get to that with a review. But this working title that we have about social sciences in the coming phoenix and interdisciplinary route to inform managers rebuilding Ukrainian organizations, we're still debating among each other whether we really want to be using that word rebuild. And the reason is, and connects back to this other term that's here about phoenix. So for those who remember Greek mythology, this was a creature that, although it was burned and destroyed, it would come back from the ashes stronger and more beautiful. And that's an important theme that we want to get at. Is this paper is around imagining a more hopeful future, but also it's applicable to things that are happening at small levels with towns and villages in territory that's being, retaken by the Ukrainian army, is to say, how do we rebuild? But when we talk about rebuilding, what we're still wrestling with just different terms in the English language, is finding the best one that captures. It's not just about going back to what you had before. It's also thinking, can we see this as a chance to make things even better than they've ever been, and really bring, the best quality of life to a place that really deserves as much? And what do we have to do to make that happen? I am going to skip this slide just for the sake of time, but what I'll say is what it touches on, and I'm happy to talk about it in the question period if anyone wants to, is Rory and I had a longer discussion about what does our profession really contribute? Where can we be most helpful? And from that came this paper, but I'll skip it because of time. One of the things that Rory suggested that was very helpful for how this paper came about is he asked me, when I was basically saying, how can I ensure that my research is as helpful as possible to Ukraine? As he said, I encourage you to do a thought experiment. If you only had 5 minutes, but you could speak with President Zelensky, what would you advise? And based on what you think you want to look at to prepare, maybe that's what you should be researching. So my reactions were, there were two. One, a big one was, if I'm going to speak with Zelensky, I think it's really important to remember that although I'm a management professor, there are other places with very smart people and very dedicated people. I should probably read and think about what they've been doing. So I thought about how this touches on international development. It's not entirely the same, but that has to be considered. What do we know from there? So that started to make me think, I think it's really important if I'm writing a paper on this, can't just be a management paper. It has to speak to other social sciences. But then my second reaction was, but I have a bit of confidence that there's probably something that management scholarship particularly can add. So that was the belief that so far as we've been doing this review has largely been validated, that maybe by bringing these literatures together, we can find critical answers to this particular question of what are we thinking about when we're, for lack of a better word, think about how Ukraine can be rebuilt now with everything that's happened. So what we're doing here is, for those who maybe don't have as much of an academic background, it's a review piece. So we're really looking at lots and lots of academic articles that have already been written, that's sort of our data, and we're trying to find themes. And the goal is to find two things. One, what is it kind of researchers have already, we know there's a lot of support for, but also if we're thinking about how this can be used for critical problems on the ground in this context, what are we missing? Where do we need more research? Where is it that scholars should be focusing their attention? And we're trying to do that by bringing together a broader group of social sciences with management. So where are we? What have we done? This is where I'll move a little quicker for time, but essentially we used the best we could as an objective rankings of journals in economics, political science, and international relations, and also some that are more specifically about international conflicts and international development. This is the list. Happy to go over it if, in the question period if there's interest. And we searched specific terms that we decided were really critical to our research project here. So we were looking at terms like genocide, international development, post-war, different spellings in case that, the algorithm misses them in one way, same with war zone, rebuild, and Ukraine. We initially had 134 articles, but when we looked at that we thought were relevant, we looked at them deeper and realized actually not really. So in the end, we ended up though with 88 articles, which is a pretty good number, which we read and reviewed in their entirety, logging, what are they finding and what are they saying? So what do this group of economists, international relations scholars, political science scholars, what do they know so far that could be relevant to rebuilding Ukraine? And that's where I'm going to touch on sort of the three themes that have emerged thus far. So this group of scholarship, they actually tell us a lot when we want to think about what is it that the Ukrainian government should be doing to rebuild. And there's a lot here that is also about how the international element of it, like in conjunction with other governments around the world, but also at different levels of government. So where is it that maybe oblasts should be doing more than Kyiv is doing, etc. But what's missing, we sort of notice, is there's a lot less about NGOs, with a little more there, but there's almost nothing about thinking about what is it the private sector could be doing to rebuild a society, rebuild a nation. And that's whether you're thinking about Ukrainian companies or increasingly more and more big like S&P 500 companies are interested in corporate social responsibility. That wasn't really here in this literature. I'll go over, move past specific examples, but I'm happy to talk about that. But in essence to say, I do want to say this is important to think about this levels issue, because this is a lot of what I meant when I said we've been validated, is we've talked among each other of how there is this consideration that sometimes these scholars in this space, they're looking at levels of, the state, a government, and, maybe below that, but there's not as much focus on an organization, and especially there's almost nothing here on the people who are in it. And all of that needs to be thought about when you're rebuilding a society. There's a lot also in this group on how is it you can raise money for rebuilding Ukraine. So critically, things like, what do you want to say to sort of the average American taxpayer so that they continue to support, whether it's, military aid now or rebuilding. But there's not as much about the kinds of things actually that Nataliia talked about, which is a Ukrainian workforce of Ukrainian employees on the ground, or people maybe who are diaspora otherwise who are coming and working in Ukraine. How do they work together effectively? And then the last theme that we looked at is there's actually quite a bit, and it's very interesting, about how is it people leveraging social psychology research rebuild their lives after war. But I think you have to be very, and we're going to talk about this in the paper, we have to be very careful how we're using it, because the issue is most of these wars, the way this has been studied, are fundamental. They're either looking at the winner in an intrastate, so like a civil war, which is not what's going on in Ukraine, as all of you know, or it's looking at the loser of a war between countries. So sometimes this will be things where what's being talked about is really, it's just not applicable to Ukraine. So there's a very interesting paper by Lawson and Tanaka about what Japanese politicians have said in terms of apologizing for World War II in the 20th century. That's an interesting thing, but that's a completely different thing that's not something we need for rebuilding Ukraine. Maybe it's something that, Russians need to read one day, if not today, but not here. However, there are other cases where this stuff is going to be relevant, even though it's different. So Michelson and Solardi are actually looking at how it is that in Mexico, children and young people who are closer to violence associated with cartel drug wars are affected in terms of their educational performance. That might be relevant to think about with, children who've seen horrors of war in Ukraine. Even though it's a different kind of war, different kind of conflict, the mechanisms are similar. Next steps, and I think this will allow us to transition well into Q of A, is just to say, so now we're going back and we're reviewing the same search terms in the management discipline. And what I'll just say is here, we're not sure what we're going to find. I'm somewhat pessimistic in that partly why we wanted to do this piece is we're sort of thinking, we haven't really noticed this paper already exists, so we want to try to create it, but you never know. Maybe we missed something really important. So that's why you do this part of the review. But what we are planning is, even if we're not finding a lot from management, there are ways in which other studies can be used, even if they weren't using a Ukrainian sample, what they studied might be really critical for Ukraine. I'm happy to share the example in Q of A, but I think maybe the best one to just highlight would be Bethany's work, which she's already presented, would be a great case. That wasn't a Ukrainian sample, but the mechanisms involved can be very applicable. So if nothing else, that's what we're hoping to bring in, where maybe management fills in some of the unanswered questions. So that's the description of our product. And I just want to give the last word. And you mentioned my family. So most importantly, here's the latest generation, Alice and Vivian Havrylyshyn, and say Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. So thank you, Andre. So you were so fast to finish that we are still waiting for you to continue. We are so into the topic. Thanks. I have my questions, but I see the audience that there are already questions in the chat. So there is a question from Nataliia Oboznenko. Maybe you're asking that yourself.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. My question to Rory Eckardt, you were saying that non-profit organizations actually are not looking for profit as business does. But my question in this context, could we see those organizations as like impact investment advisors to business or to wealthy people, and maybe it's time to change non-profit part in those names for impact or impactful organization? What do you think?
I think that's a great point. Thank you for the question and the comment. I think it's really interesting, and I think you're exactly right. And I think there's also a lot of movements that are happening in business and investment more broadly that is starting to, I think personally in a really good way, moving past the focus just on generating profits and thinking about the broader impact to society and communities and the environment, and that all of those things are interrelated anyways. But I also think they have the potential to make a much better society. So I think absolutely there can, and in my personal opinion should be, moves to kind of have more bridges and more collaborations and kind of rethinking the role that organizations play in society.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There is a question from Lena Balbeck. So Olena.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the presentations. I really enjoyed all the four reports on service. And I had two questions, one for Rory, the second for Nataliia. The first one was in terms of the part where you mentioned on introducing board of directors or external boards for the non-for-profit organizations, excuse me. And I was thinking in terms of the scale of their organization. So there are different levels of size and growth and maturity, let's say. So which one would you, are you able to distinguish when is this moment when it is recommended as a kind of next step for any organization? If you can take this, and I can just maybe move to my other one.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a excellent point and question. And just to be clear again, our study and our data was looking at large, right? Very large nonprofit charities, right? So I don't know, like empirically, like exactly the answer to that question. So, but my hunch is that it still can be helpful for smaller organizations. And the reason why is I think, and Andre and I were talking a little bit about this the other day, that I think boards also help with the long-term longevity of the organization. They help to give a broader focus on what are our goals, how are our planned actions consistent with our goals, and it just builds in this accountability mechanism that I think having that structure up front can be very helpful. And one thing I think organizations in general, whether or not they're nonprofit or profit organizations, don't often think enough up front about what is the right structure for their organization to help them to achieve whatever goals or impact they want. But I think structure is perhaps one of the most important decisions that an organization makes. And I think from the beginning, setting up a structure where you're going to have accountability and it's going to be from external can be very helpful, but not just for the corporate governance. I mean, boards are really helpful as well for thinking through difficult situations, for passing learnings between organizations. Often people will sit on multiple boards, and so they can learn and pass those learnings. They also can help make connections. So they can help to build alliance structures, for example, or relationships or partnerships across different nonprofit organizations. So while I don't have any data to support that idea, I do think it also could be applicable. Now, do you need as big a board? I don't know. I think it depends on what are the aspirations and goals of that organization. Do they want to grow to become big? Then, you know, it may be helpful as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a very good point, and something to think through. And then if I can ask the second one to Nataliia, just really quickly, thank you for the survey. I just wanted to clarify for myself. So you've addressed thousands of people. So you had thousands of respondents for your survey. Were those people particularly only volunteers? You were talking directly to volunteers actively involved in volunteer work, or just any other citizens that haven't been involved in any?
Actually, yeah, that's a great point. We talked to any civilians, any individuals in Ukraine. The approach that we took how to collect data, we contacted nonprofits and we contacted the volunteers. Since how would you get so many people? How would you convince somebody to take your survey? And nonprofits have so much power now in Ukraine. So we showed them that we have a study. This is important for us. This is important for Ukraine. We can give you results. We can give you money for that. So why not? Let's collaborate. And the study one actually showed that, yeah, we can reach so many people as we want.
Yeah, absolutely. Why I was asking is because where you listed the coping mechanism, I didn't see the actually volunteering as one of the coping mechanisms that actually help the work with stress, etc. And I just thinking you removed it purposely because you were addressing only those who were already involved, or was it just something that you weren't focused on this side of things? Because I feel like this really helps.
It does, and it's actually part of a different study 2, that we're taking the qualitative approach. We use just well-established measures, and in that one, we have an item that talks about helping others. So you can consider that as a volunteering.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I just didn't, so, but anyways, thank you for the survey. That was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I see our students like Olga, Lvova. If there is any question from you, I'm just asking the people. Okay, Nataliia, Elena is still having. Okay, Elena.
Sorry, I was just thinking just because we're running out of time, but if others are still thinking of their questions, just one more. The last one to Nataliia, in terms of if you had any idea on the duration of the effects of those coping mechanisms. So one can help you for a minute, another one for an hour, another days to go. So have you been looking at this aspect as well?
We have. We're also doing a longitudinal study that has 4 different waves. So right now we are on the wave 2, and then we're going to be comparing each wave. We're going to do a cross-sectional analysis. So it's in progress. So right now I'm presenting only one part of the study, but yes, we are still working on collecting longitudinal study, longitudinal data.
Right. Thank you.
Waiting for the others to ask their questions. I'm continuing with Nataliia because I also had some questions to her. And the questions were about the time of the 2 studies. You told that one was conducted last week, that the second one or the first one was conducted, because for me that's important if there anything conducted right now or at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. That's the difference between the periods, because a year ago, all the NGOs and the other organizations, they were feeling a bit differently as now, comparing to what's done now.
Right. That's why we have 2 different studies. And the first data collection took from May last year to September, that we had 642 individuals. And then we did study 2 that took place from beginning of December until beginning of February, and we actually control for time, and we control where the individuals were, because we see their IPO address and we see at what time they took that survey. Since we have so many individuals, and one individual will take the survey in December, another one individual took the survey in February, so we account for that.
Okay, and in the first study you had also chambers of commerce, and so I think that for the first study, you took both profit and non-profit organizations, or
So we only use those organizations to find people. So for example,
okay.
I talked to a Chamber of Commerce in Kyiv and I was like, hey, can you please distribute my survey? So they went to their Telegram channel and they said like, hey, University of Tennessee is doing this study. Would you mind filling out the survey? And the original idea was to only study entrepreneurs, but then we realized we have 50-50 results. So why not actually study individuals, and why not include individuals who work? Because yeah, it's important to study entrepreneurs, but it's also important to study people who go to work every day.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is, the third question is about your study. That was about the study 2 and the coping styles mentioned here. So the list is there any priority in that? Because, or any value, because the religion is the last, is it the last really, or one of, like the values are the same? The coping style,
right.
Like be active, and the last one, religion, that's
so actually I have the results right here. That's just a list. It's not about the importance. And as we see, the religion can actually decrease emotional exhaustion, but doesn't have any significant results on depression and PTSD.
Okay. But that's very fresh, that what Olena asked you before, the longitudinal, like, we'll see that later. Any other questions from the audience? Because I still have Oля, Lisa Kovalenko, any questions from you?
I have a question. I'm sorry, my camera somehow doesn't work. Oh, well, that's okay. Thank you very much for the interesting topics. And I have a question for Bethany, if I can, about the heroization. And it's also about the, though I appreciate the idea, but it's kind of, the question is about the long-term income about this, because it happens that I've spent the lockdown in the UK, and it was a big thing about clapping for heroes and really kind of supporting their work in words and actions and everything. But then aftermath of it, we have a huge decline in not only respect, but kind of, you know, we have a lot of NHS strike and conflicts, which are kind of were growing during all this stressful years. So do you think that your study find it, is its long-term impact, will it be helpful in Ukraine, or it's kind of better to be more different approach? Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, it does. I mean, and I think you bring up a really important distinction. So, you know, this is the US, the United States cautionary tale. We didn't look at any other countries, and I would, my guess is that the more you understand what you're saying when you say thank you, like the more you are able to say thank you, and I'm going to keep helping you, and I see you as someone who needs support from your organization, and someone who I, you know, like, so you've got the and when you actually know more up close what you're saying thank you for. Because in the US, it was more like like I said, there's a banner over a road we drove under. Like it was very distant. The actual it was very sanitized. So when you started to see what up close, more what the healthcare professionals were dealing with, sort of changed how you looked at least for me and for some of us, it changed how we looked at what thank you meant. And so I think we are in this sanitized place. So I would assume that the more you have an actual real understanding that's not sort of like a banner or like something, you know, that you're going to actually might have different results and expectations. I think what is really relevant is communicating to the US. And so we, you know, there's so many people who look at Zelensky as a hero here. And I think that's awesome. But if we're trying to make sure we keep US involvement, then he's a hero and he's someone who you need to support. Like we need to have that and built in to the conversation when we're talking about how to keep supporting Ukraine. So, I think that my answer probably just had a two-parter. It's how is it in Ukraine? And I feel like there's a chance it's not the same because this is a very different and more up close, like people are really experiencing it in a way that in the US, it was very distant. We didn't really see much unless we were in the hospitals, but so it might be different. But also if you're talking about the second part is communicating with the US, there needs to be that yes, Ukrainians are heroes and they need your help. They're not, they're not magical. Like this is a very real situation that needs financial support. So I think always be building that and I don't know if that was very clear. You can tell I'm kind of hedging because of the contextual differences of countries, but it's a really interesting problem, I think, with what do we think when are we just sort of pushing what someone needs aside when we just say hero and they need something else. I don't know. Was that sort of what you were asking?
I'd like to build something onto that, if I may. And so Bethany and I have actually discussed this when we talked about, well, first of all, she and I and Nataliia and some other co-authors are doing another project I don't need to go into all the details of, but it's more focused on people who are either they're Ukrainian and they've moved to America and they've been working in America in the midst of the last few years, or they're Ukrainian American of Ukrainian heritage. And we're sort of talking to them about, what's their experience been like being surrounded by people who are not as personally tied to the war as you are, and what's helped and not helped. And a very interesting theme that's emerged is sometimes they've talked about how they do appreciate when people are showing kindness directly to them and asking, how's your family, or our thoughts and prayers are with you. But some of them using language that can't necessarily repeat here, but you can imagine, their focus has been, and what they've said they appreciate most from sort of Americans who are not Ukrainian colleagues, is they say, it's when you condemn the enemy. It's when you say things that show me you're not being neutral. You're not just saying, oh, well, Russia's got a different view. They're saying, no, what they're doing is wrong. It's a war crime. They need to be arrested. They need to be brought to the, that's what they appreciate most. And the reason I bring it up is because what Bethany and I talked about is, if we were to find studying, similar questions in Ukraine about, how you feel when you're called the hero or victim, and it's different from what is the results of Bethany's paper, what might explain it? And one thing that we've been discussing at a very high level is, well, when you think about COVID-19, it's this microcosm disease. But in Ukraine, there's this concern for, and I'll say that I think the key is its accountability of saying there's another actor here, which is who's doing this to me. There's somebody who has wronged me, who's committed an injustice, who's my enemy right now, and they need to be held to account. And so what I want to just bring in with that notion is the idea that might go a long way to explain a very key part that's been brought up so far, which is over time. How does this change? It might be that at the beginning, it's important to say, you are a hero, I admire what you're doing. But as time goes on, it can be an understandable reaction to say, okay, I appreciate it, I heard that. And what I now want to know is, what are you going to do to hold to account the person who did this wrong? So for example, this is where it might go a long way to explain, like where a lot of the news conversation has been movements to say, boycott Russia from the Olympics, for example, or more discussion in the media about the Wagner Group to say these individuals need to be found and arrested and extradited to, face charges for crimes against humanity and such. And I think that's important to think about as this third factor that can be about, are you a hero or, are you suffering or are you a victim? But it might also be about, is there condemnation of the perpetrator, of the person who's done the wrong? And that might be an important factor in all of this.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you both, Bethany and Andrea, for the questions and for the answers. And here is the question from Oля Lvova. Do you want me to read that out, or you'll do that yourself? Okay. The question is, first of all, thank you very much for the presentations. And my question is to any of the speakers, what do you think will be the biggest challenge for NGO sector after the war?
I think that's a great question. I'm not sure I have the expertise to speak to that, or the kind of local knowledge about those things, but I will at least tell you what my thoughts are about it. What I suspect, I don't know if the biggest, but I think a challenge could be about trying to ensure that there's both coordination and collaboration for the efforts of NGOs, both within an NGO and across NGOs. So I think trying to ensure that the efforts within an organization, right, are really coordinated and facilitated in a manner to really optimize the possible collaboration among those individuals, as well as between the organizations.
I'll jump in again. I won't say it's the biggest. I'll say it's a challenge that jumps to my mind that I think is worth thinking about. And I'll say that my bias here is that I'm probably saying this because it's coming from who I am so personally, but maybe it's more who I am. I see a unique vantage point on this, which is I think I have a complex identity and connection to Ukraine. I don't want to refer to myself as Ukrainian because I'm not a Ukrainian citizen, and I didn't grow up and live in Ukraine for extended periods of time. But to not include it as part of my identity, I think isn't fully capturing how much it was a key part of being, in the Ukrainian American community growing up. And why I bring all that up is because I think there's going to be a very unique challenge of, on one hand, there really should be and needs to be involvement of rebuilding Ukraine, of those outside of Ukraine, that there's a moral responsibility for the rest of the world to care enough to get involved and not just be like, oh, Ukraine won. Okay, well, good luck rebuilding. It's going to be a huge project. There is a moral imperative for the rest of the world to care and to continue to be committed. On the other hand, a balance needs to be struck of not having it be like tons of people from, NATO countries just come in and try to do things their way. There needs to be an active role and a driving role, really, of people who live there, who are Ukrainians, who this is their home, are really taking the lead on how this is done. That is going to be a very important challenge to get right, is how do you get people who are sort of well-meaning outsiders who are coming, or even just collab, even if they're not physically coming, they're just regularly giving their time and effort, to do so in a way that's not undercutting or taking away the importance of having, it be Ukrainians rebuilding their own home, their own country kind of thing. I think that's an important challenge for NGOs to think about.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Nataliia? No.
Yeah, I can answer. I don't think that's the biggest challenge. I actually see opportunity in this. Since it's about setting different goals and restructuring what you want to do for Ukraine. Like, for example, there are so many individuals who are ready to help Ukraine, to rebuild Ukraine, but they're saying that, hey, but something else can happen. So they're not ready to help. And I feel like there are going to be so many other nonprofits that will be ready, like, hey, the war, it's over. Now we are ready to help. It's the same way if you look at different nonprofits. Some nonprofits are focusing on helping kids, right? They're not going to come to Ukraine and rebuild Ukraine. But there will be some nonprofits that would see the opportunity. There will be a refocus of goals. Let's say that.
Mm-hmm. So there is Bethany left. Just don't want you to be lost if you want to tell something.
Well, this is just sort of a little bit from the beginning of our data. We were starting to see this, and it's, I wish I had a solution. I don't like when people bring up problems and don't have an idea how to fix it. But I worry that there's a sort of compassion fatigue that happens, especially when people are not sort of directly or intimately connected to something. So just for example, the department I work in, we've been, we've had colleagues from India, Turkey. I work with people from Ukraine, and it's like, it feels like when the next thing comes, people forget about the previous thing, even when it's still going on. And so I don't know, I wish I had a solution, but that feels like, to me, mobilizing people who are that you want to include as part of the nonprofit effort, like fundraising, mobilizing them to continue to be interested and donate, or, you know, their countries donate, etc. Like, I feel like I don't have I'm so sorry I'm bringing what I consider to be a challenge without an idea of how to solve it, but I worry about that. And maybe part of this is just acknowledging, hey, this could become a problem and we just need to do what's been done, you know, effectively using social media, getting people in front of Congress, like, you know, just, I don't know what the solution is, but that's always something that worries me, is like, when there's an ongoing problem and other people have moved on, like, how do we bring them back and keep them caring about it? Sorry.
I'll throw in something really quickly that I don't really have the time to cite all the literature, but I'm just thinking of, you know, literature in our field that could be cited to support what I'm about to say, which is, so some of this gets to a question of what would motivate someone. Like, in the end, is it overly important why someone is doing things, or is it just they have their reason why they're there and they're keeping on it? So a lot of the problem you're raising is, if your reason for wanting to help Ukraine is sympathy or compassion, they've been so wronged and they deserve to be helped, that'll only take you so far. So what I would raise is, well, if the key thing is that they keep being committed, you could leverage some other motivator. And the one that I'm thinking of there is, we see this a bit more in the private sector, but there's no reason NGOs can't do this, is you reframe it as, it's not just about they do deserve to be helped, and there's been injustices committed against them. But there's also the idea that before that, during that, and beyond that, this is opportunity. These are impressive people capable of impressive things. This is an investment. That rebuilding Ukraine is an investment in a better humanity, because on the other side of this, they can produce things that make us all richer, that make us all better, kind of thing. You know, that kind of something can grow from this that pays dividends, could be a motivator too, possibly. Just a thought to consider.
Yeah, if I can add on to that, just one thought I had is, I think thinking carefully about whose support is needed from, and how to focus efforts and attention on that. So it's not clear always that, like, you know, rhythms of social media, you know, essentially fashion, right, and those things matter, right, in the long term, right? So thinking carefully about who are the groups and people that the commitment and connections with are important, and focusing efforts on that. And one of the ways for me that I think is that I think about change and like maintaining things, I think, is to understand the social network that surrounds those individuals that you need that commitment from, figuring out who are the influencers in that network, and targeting your communications and interventions to those individuals. Because I think if you maintain the connections and attention with those influencers, you will maintain connections with the whole network.
Thank you. There is I wanted to summarize, but there is still a very short question from one of the participants. When is the time, the best time to invest in Ukraine, nowadays or after the war?
Is that for anyone specific or all of us?
To the speakers, when it is normal to invest in a country, Ukraine, is it the date of winning of Ukraine, or nowadays, or other days? That's in the chat.
I can jump in, and I would say now, and the reason I'm saying that is because, so I want to contrast. I've had this discussion with my wife about personal finances, but also just friends in times. And I read an article once that pointed out something critical, which is when it comes to disaster relief, there's always this trend that when it's first in the news, they get a huge influx of money. And then, 6 months later, it's fallen off, because the attention's gone. And that can be a real problem, in that certain tasks, they can't even get to certain villages that are affected until like 3 months, the roads have been cleared, kind of thing. And now they don't have as much money to help. So there's always that thing to watch about, do you want to invest right away, or do you maybe wait when everyone else has forgotten? That's when you send your money there. And all I want to point, why I use that example is, I don't think that's the issue right now. I think if anything, with sort of what Bethany mentioned with compassion fatigue, we're seeing the opposite risk in terms of, the quote unquote West's thoughts about Ukraine. We're starting to see that, there are those parties and those actors, and unfortunately some of them are in Congress, that are starting to say like, oh, well, we should move on, or why is this our problem, kind of thing. So I don't see anything preventing from saying, well, anything that be done now is, because certainly, as I don't need to tell everyone in this room, the need is still present. So if that's the case, and there's not like an overdoing of it, then I say now.
Thank you. So Solomia will finish after me, but my last, not the question, but just that's up to you. Out of the results of your field of interest, of your research, is there anything, any recommendation or anything, the most important thing or anything you would like to recommend for NGO to use to be the drivers of that Ukraine's recovery?
I'll start with one. It's not specific to NGOs. I would advise similar things to private sector entities, but it's still applies to NGOs. When you're thinking about your people, which is always really critical, and especially in terms of teamwork, try to think about, well, what gets you to your performance goals? Is this a case where you want to make sure your people are all really good on some skill because you think that the team is just the result of them all being good at that one skill? Or is your effective team a case where maybe person A is only good at one thing and person B is only good at another thing, but you put them in different places, you delegate as working, you make sure they're just handling different tasks, and that way between them, everything gets done and the team is more effective. There's not one answer for teams research, and there's not one answer for, different teams in different organizations. But I think that's a question that doesn't get thought about enough. It is sort of what makes the team, and especially when it comes to effectiveness. Is it just the average, the sum of everybody on these key considerations? Because sometimes that's the case, but other times it's really about ensuring that the team are we putting each of these people in the right position for them, where between all of them, the team is doing what it has to.
Thank you.
I don't know, Nataliia and Rory, Bethany, if you wanted to add anything.
I'm going to bring up
something. Yes.
The thing I'm going to bring up is, I think, especially in work that feels like work you're very passionate about, that recovery is really important. So whatever Nataliia says, do that.
I'm still working on my project, so give me a few months. But I think it's also important to collaborate with other nonprofits from outside the Ukraine, since they have different perspectives, they have different knowledge, they have different resources, they have different network. So for Ukrainian NGOs, it would be extremely beneficial to find a partner outside of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. So when Rory is left.
Yeah, I've probably too many thoughts to be able to convey, but they're mostly just thoughts, right? So what are some things I think that might be helpful to think about? And it goes back to some things I mentioned earlier about thinking very carefully about structure and design of the system. I think it's such, I think, an important factor that influences where a system of any sorts goes, but particularly organizations and people that are within them. So, for example, some structure and design things are, how much are employee-owned companies, for example, a focus? Because I think that fundamentally changes the organization. How much are market-like mechanisms built in to allocate resources and coordinate across them? And I think typically we think about market-based mechanisms as like the stock market or certain capital structures, but they can be used in other ways. For example, there was a really interesting story I heard a number of years ago about food banks that were having a hard time allocating food donations to communities that needed it. And they talked to an economist, and the economist said, well, why don't you create a market? And they're like, no one's buying or selling anything. How could we have a market? And they said, easy, just create a fake market where you give a certain number of points to all the different food banks that can then bid on the donations. And you can use this actually very creatively to move around food to areas that are in need. So some communities maybe have greater need for those donations, and so give them more points to bid. And so they created this fake market that essentially they could have donations posted, food banks bidding, and it improved the efficiency of the allocation across all of it. Other design principles that are pertinent, I think, to what the paper I presented today was about transparency and accountability, right? Upfront thinking about those and how to incorporate those and why to incorporate those, I think is really important. So thinking very carefully about that structure and design aspect, it is such an incredible challenge to coordinate and facilitate collaboration across people and organizations. And there can be a lot of loss in efficiency, which ultimately impacts effectiveness for communities, societies, organizations, etc. So for example, I think if one doesn't think about that, you can end up with 5 different NGOs all doing the same thing that actually end up competing with each other and hurt the ability to actually have the meaningful impact that each one of those organizations wants. Last thing I'll say is, this relates to Andre's presentation about thinking about it as a system that moves across levels of analysis. So there's things at a very macro level that are, country or region focused, and there's industries, and there's organizations and groups within those, and groups of people within those, and individual aspects. Thinking about it as the system involving all of those components, that one needs to really think about the orchestration of all of those aspects, I think is a really important thing. And then the last thing I'll say is, when you're faced with the challenge that the organization is facing, talk to experts in different disciplines. Talk to a psychologist and ask them what they would suggest. Talk to an economist and ask them what they would suggest. Talk to a sociologist and ask them what they would suggest. Talk to a political scientist and ask them what they would suggest. And think about, how can you integrate and leverage all those different perspectives? Because I think that's the key unique advantage that organizations have, is they integrate all of those perspectives. And I think all of those disciplines have value, and they can offer unique insight into that. So anyway, sorry, I told you I had a lot of ideas. Anyways, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for participation, and the speakers for your contribution. You see that the topics are so interesting that we could spend the whole evening listening to that. Probably we'll have some additional possibility to listen to you, maybe in different situation. Maybe we'll organize something else. And I just forgot to tell that we have the presentations of all the 4 speakers, and they agreed to send to the participants, because there were some questions about that. Yes, we do have the presentations, and we can use them for the participants to be sent. So thank you. And Solomia, finally, the floor is yours to summarize and to close.
I just also wanted to thank for everyone for participation. And first of all, I wanted to thank our speakers. It's okay. Do you hear me? So I thank you for all speakers, because in other side of the ocean, it's just an early morning. And thank you for your willingness to support Ukraine, and that you think about Ukraine, and for your presentation sharing here. And actually also thank you for all participants for your active participation and discussion. And for us in Institute of Leadership and Management, it's very important that we can discuss this question, the role of NGOs after the war, after in the recovery process of Ukraine, from with different sides, different perspectives, and with also scientists from abroad. And here in Ukraine, we maybe not see all the perspective, and it's very important such discussion. And probably we can also continue to communicate and discuss about the role of NGOs in different ways. So thank you everyone, and have a nice day, evening, where you are.